In the mountains of western North Carolina stands a house that should not exist. Biltmore Estate contains 250 rooms spread across 4 acres of floor space. It has 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, and an indoor pool. When George Vanderbilt completed construction in 1895, the project had consumed 6 years and cost approximately $6 million. Adjusted for inflation, that exceeds $200 million in today's currency. No American has built anything remotely comparable since. The reason has nothing to do with changing architectural tastes or declining ambition. The world that made Biltmore possible was destroyed deliberately through taxation, regulation, and public fury at extreme wealth. What replaced it reveals something darker about modern inequality. The billionaires did not disappear. They simply learned to hide. In 1888, George Washington Vanderbilt II was 26 years old and controlled a fortune that exceeded the annual budget of most American states. He was the youngest grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had died 11 years earlier as the richest man in America. The Commodore had built his empire on steamships and railroads, transforming transportation across the continent. When he died in 1877, his estate was valued at approximately $15 million, more than the entire United States Treasury held in gold reserves at the time. The fortune passed primarily to the Commodore's son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who proved even more capable than his father. William doubled the inheritance within 8 years through railroad expansion and ruthless management. When William died in 1885, he left approximately $200 million divided among his 8 children. George received roughly $10 million outright, plus substantial trust income. At 23 years old, he became wealthier than he could spend in several lifetimes. George was different from his relatives. His older brothers built mansions in Manhattan and Newport, competing to construct the most elaborate showpieces on Fifth Avenue and along the Rhode Island coast. They hosted costume balls that cost fortunes and filled newspapers with scandalized accounts of excess. George preferred books to parties. He spoke 8 languages, collected art, and traveled Europe studying architecture and landscape design. He was shy, intellectual, and uncomfortable with the performative wealth displays that defined Gilded Age society. In 1888, George visited Asheville, North Carolina, for his health. Doctors recommended the mountain air for his chronic respiratory problems. The town sat in a valley surrounded by the Blue Ridge Mountains, accessible by railroad, but still relatively isolated from eastern cities. The climate was temperate, the scenery was spectacular, the land was cheap. George saw something beyond a health retreat. The forests reminded him of European estates he had visited. The mountains provided natural boundaries and privacy. The region was economically depressed, which meant labor and materials would cost far less than in the industrialized North. He could build something here that would be impossible elsewhere. He began purchasing land immediately. By 1889, he had acquired approximately 125,000 acres surrounding Asheville, an area larger than many eastern cities. The price was remarkably low. Much of the land had been logged or farmed to exhaustion. Local owners, struggling economically after the Civil War's devastation of the South, sold eagerly to the wealthy Northerner offering cash. George hired the best designers money could procure. Richard Morris Hunt was America's preeminent architect. Trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, Hunt had designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty and numerous Fifth Avenue mansions for the Vanderbilt family. He understood grand scale and classical proportion. George asked him to design a house worthy of the mountain setting. Frederick Law Olmsted received the Landscape Commission. Olmsted had designed Central Park in Manhattan and parks in dozens of American cities. He had pioneered the profession of landscape architecture in the United States. At 67 years old, he was at the peak of his capabilities and reputation. George wanted Olmsted to transform 125,000 acres of cut-over forest and exhausted farmland into a planned landscape that would rival anything in Europe. The initial conception was modest by comparison to what eventually emerged. George spoke of building a country house where he could retreat from society and pursue his intellectual interests. Hunt sketched a comfortable residence. Olmsted proposed gardens and a working farm. The project expanded rapidly. Hunt's sketches grew more elaborate with each revision. George wanted a library to house his growing book collection, which already numbered in the thousands. He wanted guest rooms for extended visits from family and friends. He wanted entertainment spaces appropriate for occasional social obligations. He wanted technological systems that would make the house comfortable and modern. Hunt looked to the Loire Valley in France for inspiration. The chateau of the French Renaissance combined grandeur with livability, formality with elegance. He designed a 4-story limestone structure with a steeply pitched roof, massive chimneys, and elaborate stone carving. The style was French Renaissance revival transplanted to the American South. Olmsted conceived something unprecedented in America. Rather than simply landscaping around a house, he would create a managed landscape encompassing the entire property. Formal gardens would surround the residence. Beyond them, planned forests would demonstrate scientific forestry practices. A model farm would prove that modern agricultural methods could restore the region's depleted soil. The estate would be self-sufficient, producing its own food, lumber, and income. Construction began in 1889. A private railroad spur was built to the construction site to transport materials. Limestone was quarried in Indiana and shipped south. Craftsmen were recruited from across America and Europe. At peak activity, more than 1,000 workers labored on the house and grounds simultaneously. The scale defied anything previously attempted by a private individual in America. The foundations required excavating into bedrock. The steel structural frame was engineered to support stone walls 4 feet thick. The roof covered more than an acre. Every system was designed for permanence, as though the house would stand for centuries. George visited the site regularly during construction, making decisions on details that ranged from stone selection to furniture placement. He worked directly with Hunt and Olmsted, refining plans as the structure rose. The project consumed his attention completely. He had no interest in business or politics. Biltmore became his life's work. The house was designed around specific functions. The ground floor contained public spaces, a banquet hall that could seat 64 guests, a library designed to hold 10,000 volumes, a billiard room, and multiple sitting rooms. The second floor held family bedrooms and guest suites. The third floor contained additional guest rooms and storage. The fourth floor housed servants' quarters. Below ground, a basement level contained kitchens, mechanical systems, and a swimming pool. Technology was integrated throughout. Electric lights powered by the estate's own generator illuminated every room. Central heating systems carried steam through miles of pipes. An intercom system allowed communication between floors. Elevators transported people and supplies. The house contained innovations that most American buildings would not adopt for decades. Olmsted's landscape work proceeded simultaneously. He planted hundreds of thousands of trees and shrubs, many imported from Europe and Asia. He created a 3-mile approach road that wound through planned forest designed to build anticipation before revealing the house. Formal gardens descended from terraces behind the residence, featuring fountains, statuary, and seasonal plantings. The farm encompassed thousands of acres, with dairy operations, vegetable gardens, and livestock. By 1895, construction was sufficiently complete for occupancy. George opened the house on Christmas Eve with a family celebration. The project had consumed 6 years and approximately $6 million, equivalent to more than $200 million in current dollars. The result was unlike anything else in America. Biltmore contained 250 rooms spread across approximately 175,000 square feet of finished floor space. It had 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. The banquet hall rose 75 feet to a barrel-vaulted ceiling. The library shelves stretched 2 stories high. The indoor swimming pool measured 70 feet long, lined with imported tile. The house was simultaneously a residence, a museum, and a statement about what private wealth could accomplish. George was 33 years old when he moved in. He had created the largest private residence in American history. He had employed thousands of workers for years. He had proven that a wealthy man could build something that rivaled European palaces. He had also built something that was already obsolete. The world that made Biltmore possible was about to change completely. On Christmas Eve, 1895, George Vanderbilt opened Biltmore House to his family for the first time. Snow covered the Blue Ridge Mountains. The approach road wound through 3 miles of planned forest before revealing the chateau rising from its terraced hillside. Inside, electric lights illuminated rooms filled with art and furniture collected across Europe. A fire burned in the banquet hall beneath a 75-foot barrel-vaulted ceiling. The house was finally ready. The numbers defined what George had built. Biltmore contained 250 rooms across 4 stories, plus a full basement. There were 35 bedrooms for family and guests. 43 bathrooms featured modern plumbing with hot and cold running water. 65 fireplaces provided supplemental heating throughout the structure. The finished floor space measured approximately 175,000 square feet, roughly 4 acres under one roof. Richard Morris Hunt had designed the exterior in the style of the Loire Valley Chateau. Indiana limestone formed walls 4 feet thick at the foundation. The steeply pitched roof rose to elaborate chimneys and decorative spires. Stone carving covered the facade with Renaissance details that required craftsmen trained in traditional European techniques. The effect from a distance suggested a French palace transported to the American mountains. The interior spaces reflected George's intention to create not just a residence, but a private museum. The entrance hall rose 3 stories, lit by a massive wrought iron chandelier. The banquet hall could seat 64 guests at a single table beneath a ceiling painted with medieval designs. The library occupied 2 stories with shelves designed to hold 10,000 volumes. George's collection already numbered more than 20,000 books in 8 languages. The winter garden brought the outdoors inside. A glass-roofed conservatory featured a central fountain surrounded by tropical plants that would bloom year-round. Palm trees reached toward skylights 3 stories above. This space demonstrated that technology could overcome climate, providing a permanent summer within the mountain winter. Recreation facilities reflected Gilded Age excess adapted to private use. The bowling alley in the basement featured equipment imported from European manufacturers. An indoor swimming pool measured 70 feet long, lined with tile, brought from manufacturers who specialized in Turkish baths. A gymnasium contained equipment from modern physical culture. These were luxuries that only the wealthiest hotels offered to the public. George installed them for his personal use. The technological systems integrated throughout Biltmore represented the cutting edge of 1890s engineering. Electric lighting, powered by the estate's own generating plant, eliminated the need for gas or oil lamps. Central heating distributed steam through miles of copper pipes to radiators in every major room. An electric intercom system connected rooms across the vast house, allowing servants to receive instructions without walking the corridors. 2 elevators carried passengers and freight between floors. Refrigeration systems cooled rooms designated for food storage. These were innovations that most American buildings would not adopt for another generation. The staff required to operate Biltmore numbered more than 80 people living on the estate. 30 servants worked inside the house as cooks, maids, butlers, and footmen. Additional workers maintained the mechanical systems, tended the grounds, and operated the farm. The fourth floor of the house was devoted entirely to servants' quarters, with small bedrooms, separate dining facilities, and a network of back and service passages that allowed staff to move through the building without disturbing the family. Frederick Law Olmsted's landscape work extended across the entire 125,000-acre property. Immediately surrounding the house, formal gardens descended in a series of terraces. The Italian garden featured a reflecting pool and classical statuary. The walled garden enclosed 3 acres of flowering plants arranged in geometric beds. The shrub garden collected specimens from across the world in a naturalistic setting. Beyond the formal gardens, Olmsted created what he called a managed forest. He hired Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service, to implement scientific forestry practices on thousands of acres. The goal was to prove that American forests could be harvested sustainably while remaining profitable. The Biltmore Forestry Program became a model for conservation efforts nationwide and trained a generation of professional foresters. The farm operations occupied thousands of additional acres. A dairy herd produced milk, butter, and cheese. Vegetable gardens supplied the house kitchen. Livestock provided meat. Orchards yielded fruit. The estate was designed to be self-sufficient, producing everything needed for daily operations while also generating income from surplus production sold to the local market. The financial reality was less sustainable than George hoped. Annual operating costs for the house and grounds exceeded $250,000, equivalent to millions in current dollars. George's income from his inheritance and trust funds was substantial, but not unlimited. The estate consumed wealth faster than his investments generated it. Within a few years of completion, George began seeking ways to reduce expenses. He married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898, 3 years after opening the house. Their daughter Cornelia was born in 1900, the only child George would have. The house that could accommodate dozens of guests and required a staff of 80 was occupied by a family of 3. George tried various schemes to make the estate financially viable. He opened a commercial dairy to sell Biltmore products to a wider market. He sold timber from the managed forests. He experimented with different agricultural approaches on the farmland. None generated sufficient revenue to offset the crushing operating costs. The house itself was simply too large and too expensive to maintain, even for a Vanderbilt. The problem was structural, not personal. Biltmore represented the absolute peak of what private wealth could build in America at the end of the 19th century. But the economic conditions that made such construction possible were already changing. George had built his chateau during a brief window when vast inherited fortunes faced almost no taxation. Labor was cheap and abundant, and society accepted extreme displays of wealth as natural consequences of industrial success. That window was closing. The panic of 1893 had shaken public confidence in unregulated capitalism. Labor unions were organizing against the industrialists whose fortunes funded estates like Biltmore. Progressive politicians were beginning to question whether such concentrated wealth served any public good. George died unexpectedly in 1914 following complications from an appendectomy. His widow, Edith, inherited the estate and immediately confronted the financial crisis that George had been delaying. The house was consuming her resources. Property taxes were increasing as local governments sought revenue. The national mood was turning against ostentatious displays of inherited wealth. Edith made a decision that would save Biltmore, but transform it completely. In 1930, she opened the house and gardens to paying tourists. Admission fees would help cover operating costs. The private residence became a public attraction. The family continued living in a small section of the house, but most rooms were now displayed for visitors who paid to see how the ultra-wealthy had lived a generation earlier. The transformation revealed something fundamental about Gilded Age mansions. They could not survive as residences. The economic model that built them had collapsed. The only way to preserve them was to convert them into museums, monuments to an era that had ended almost as soon as it began. Other Vanderbilt properties faced similar choices. The Breakers in Newport, Marble House, and dozens of family estates would eventually open to the public or be demolished. The generation that built these houses intended them as dynasty headquarters that would shelter their descendants for centuries. Instead, they became tourist attractions within decades. Biltmore stood at the peak of American mansion building. It was the largest, the most expensive, and the last of its kind. Nothing comparable would ever be built again, not because Americans lost their ambition or their wealth, but because the rules changed. The forces that would make Biltmore impossible to repeat were already gathering strength in 1895. Within 20 years, they would fundamentally alter how wealthy Americans could live. In 1913, the same year George Vanderbilt died, the United States government fundamentally altered the rules of American wealth. On February 3rd, the states completed ratification of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. Congress now possessed permanent authority to levy taxes on income from whatever source derived. The era of untaxed fortunes was over. Before 1913, the federal government had imposed an income tax only briefly during the Civil War. That temporary measure expired in 1872. The Supreme Court struck down a subsequent attempt in 1895, ruling that direct taxation without apportionment among the states violated the Constitution. For most of the Gilded Age, wealthy Americans faced no federal income tax whatsoever. They could accumulate and spend their fortunes without government interference beyond modest tariffs and excise taxes. The 16th Amendment changed everything. Congress passed the first permanent income tax law in October 1913. The initial rates appeared modest. Income below $3,000 faced no tax at all. Income between $3,000 and $20,000 was taxed at 1%. The top marginal rate of 7% applied only to income exceeding $500,000 annually, which affected perhaps a few hundred families nationwide. The rates did not stay modest. World War I demanded unprecedented government revenue. Congress raised the top marginal rate to 15% in 1916, then to 67% in 1917, and finally to 77% in 1918. The threshold for the top rate dropped to $1 million, capturing a larger number of wealthy individuals. A man who earned $2 million in 1918 would surrender more than $1.5 million to federal taxation. The war ended, but the high rates largely remained. Congress reduced the top rate to 73% in 1921, then to 58% in 1922, and finally to 25% in 1925. For a few years, it appeared that taxation might return to something approaching the pre-war norm. Wealthy families resumed building, spending, and displaying their fortunes as they had before. The Great Depression destroyed that hope permanently. The stock market collapsed in October 1929. Banks failed by the thousands. Unemployment reached 25% nationally. The American economy contracted by roughly 1/3 within 4 years. Public fury at the wealthy intensified as breadlines lengthened and shantytowns spread. President Herbert Hoover proposed raising taxes on the rich to address the deficit and fund relief programs. Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1932, which increased the top marginal rate to 63%. When Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency in a landslide that November, he made higher taxes on the wealthy a centerpiece of his New Deal agenda. The Revenue Act of 1935 raised the top rate to 79% on income exceeding $5 million annually. Roosevelt called it the wealth tax, and he defended it explicitly as an attack on concentrated fortunes. He argued that extreme inequality threatened democracy itself, and that progressive taxation would redistribute wealth more fairly across society. By 1940, the top marginal rate had reached 81%. During World War II, it climbed to 94% on income over $200,000. For the next 3 decades, the top rate never dropped below 70%. A wealthy American who earned $1 million annually might keep less than $100,000 after federal taxes. The income tax was only part of the squeeze on mansion economics. Estate taxes struck when wealth transferred between generations. Congress first imposed a federal estate tax in 1916 at a maximum rate of 10%. The rate rose steadily, reaching 77% by 1941. The combination was devastating for families attempting to maintain large estates across generations. A fortune that survived income taxation while the original builder lived faced estate taxation when he died. Property taxes escalated simultaneously at state and local levels. A mansion that might have faced property taxes of a few thousand annually in 1913 could face bills exceeding $50,000 by the 1930s. The ongoing cost of owning a palace became prohibitive regardless of income. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Consider a mansion requiring $250,000 annually to operate. In 1913, a man with $500,000 in annual income faced no federal income tax and could easily cover those expenses. By 1935, that same income faced federal taxes approaching $400,000. The remaining $100,000 could not maintain the estate and support the family. The servants who maintained these houses were also disappearing. The domestic service industry contracted dramatically during the 1920s and collapsed during the Depression. Industrial jobs paid better than household service. Social attitudes shifted against servitude as a career. Labor laws added pressure. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established minimum wages and maximum hours for most workers. The cheap, abundant labor that had made Gilded Age estates economically feasible was vanishing. No technology could eliminate the fundamental problem. A 250-room house remained vastly more expensive to operate than a 20-room house. Regardless of mechanical improvements, the wealthy adapted by reducing scale. New construction in the 1920s and 1930s featured far fewer rooms. Wealthy families built large, comfortable homes, but not palaces. Existing mansions became liabilities. Property that had been assets on balance sheets transformed into drains on family resources. Families faced a choice: maintain the mansion and watch the fortune disappear, or demolish the house and liquidate the asset. Most chose demolition. Income tax, estate tax, and property tax had created an environment where maintaining a mega-mansion was financially suicidal. The government had not made such houses illegal, it had simply made them impossible to sustain. The tax code had solved a political problem: extreme wealth inequality, which had threatened social stability. Fortunes could still be built, but they could not be preserved intact across generations while maintaining ostentatious displays of consumption. The billionaires who survived this transformation did not become poor, they simply learned to live differently. The demolition began on Fifth Avenue. In 1926, the mansion that Cornelius Vanderbilt II had built at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street came down. Completed in 1883, the house had featured 130 rooms and a ballroom for 1,200 guests. Demolition took less than 6 months. The site became commercial property. A bank and office building replaced the mansion, generating rental income that dwarfed what the residence had cost to maintain. The Vanderbilts had made the economically rational choice. The pattern repeated across Manhattan. William Kissam Vanderbilt's mansion at 665th Avenue was demolished in 1927. Carolyn Sherman Horne Astor's mansion at Fifth Avenue and 65th Street disappeared in 1926. The mansion that hosted the city's social power was razed to make room for a luxury apartment building. In 1900, more than 100 major Gilded Age mansions lined Fifth Avenue. By 1950, fewer than 10 survived. The rest had been replaced with apartment buildings, hotels, and commercial structures. Newport, Rhode Island faced a similar wave. The Breakers survived only because the family donated it to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1948. The alternative was demolition. No family member could afford to maintain a 70-room summer house that required 40 servants to operate. Marble House followed the same path. Chicago lost virtually its entire collection, including Potter Palmer's Castle on Lakeshore Drive, which was demolished in 1950. Houses built to last centuries were demolished within 2 or 3 generations because the economics were inescapable. Institutional use justified preservation. Residential use guaranteed demolition. Even Biltmore, the largest and most famous of all, survived only by opening to tourists in 1930. The Vanderbilt family retained ownership, but could no longer afford to live in the entire house. Admission fees from visitors covered operating costs that no family could sustain privately. The house became a museum that happened to have family members still living in one wing. The billionaires who remained after the mansion die-off adapted to a world where visible displays of wealth invited taxation and public fury. They shifted wealth away from residential real estate entirely. Rather than investing hundreds of millions of dollars in a single showpiece mansion, modern billionaires deploy capital across diverse holdings that generate returns. Bill Gates lives in a house called Xanadu 2.0. The residence measures approximately 66,000 square feet. This is large, but it is not a palace. It is not meant to be seen from the street or to inspire awe in visitors. The approach is deliberately understated, with trees screening the property from public view. Jeff Bezos follows a similar pattern, distributing his holdings across multiple properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars collectively. Mark Zuckerberg bought his Palo Alto home for $7 million and then purchased the 4 surrounding properties for a combined $43 million to create a buffer zone. The strategy was not expansion, but privacy. Building a visible palace creates security liabilities, invites higher taxation, and generates negative public relations. The strategic response has been to shift wealth into channels that generate returns rather than consuming resources. Bezos announced the Bezos Earth Fund in 2020, committing $10 billion to fight climate change. The sum represents approximately 8% of his net worth at the time. A substantial commitment, but hardly a sacrifice. The fund provides Bezos with significant influence over climate policy and environmental organizations worldwide. More importantly, it provides favorable publicity at a time when Amazon faces increasing criticism for its environmental impact and labor practices. The tax implications are substantial. A billionaire who donates $10 billion to a charitable foundation receives a tax deduction for the full amount. At the highest tax rates, this could save approximately $4 billion in federal taxes. The remaining $6 billion, which the billionaire genuinely surrendered, purchases enormous influence over how and where those funds are deployed. The foundation invests the endowment, generating returns that fund grants in perpetuity. The donor's priorities shape charitable giving long after their death.
Media ownership provides another channel for influence that mansions could never deliver. Jeff Bezos purchased the Washington Post in 2013 for $250 million. This was pocket change for a man worth more than $100 billion at the time. But the acquisition provided ownership of one of America's most influential newspapers, a publication that shapes political discourse in the nation's capital. The Post operates independently under Bezos' ownership, maintaining journalistic standards that predate his acquisition. But the mere fact of his ownership raises inevitable questions about coverage of Amazon, his space company Blue Origin, and his personal affairs. Publishers traditionally wielded enormous political influence. Bezos acquired that influence for less than the cost of maintaining Biltmore for 2 years. Laurene Powell Jobs, widow of Apple founder Steve Jobs, purchased a majority stake in The Atlantic magazine in 2017. Mark Benioff, founder of Salesforce, bought Time magazine in 2018 for $190 million. Patrick Soon-Shiong purchased the Los Angeles Times in 2018 for $500 million. In each case, billionaires acquired major media properties for sums that represented tiny fractions of their total wealth. The pattern reflects a calculated strategy. Major media properties confer prestige and influence disproportionate to their financial value. Most operate at losses or narrow margins, making them unattractive to profit-focused investors. But for billionaires seeking platforms to shape public discourse, these properties are bargains. The cost of ownership is trivial. The potential influence is substantial. Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter in 2022 for approximately $44 billion represents the extreme version of this strategy. The platform served as a primary channel for political discourse and news dissemination. Musk's purchase gave him control over the algorithms that determine what hundreds of millions of people see, the moderation policies that govern what they can post, and the features that shape how they interact. The price was substantial, but the acquisition provided something no mansion could offer: control over infrastructure. The comparison to Gilded Age power is instructive. John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of American oil refining, but his power was ultimately constrained by antitrust law. Modern platform owners exercise power more directly. They control the systems through which information flows. Mark Zuckerberg controls Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, platforms with more than 3 billion combined users. The algorithms that determine what content these users see and the policies that govern what they can post are controlled by Zuckerberg. No king, president, or prime minister exercises comparable power over so many people. Jeff Bezos built Amazon into a platform that controls approximately 40% of American e-commerce. Amazon Web Services provides the infrastructure that runs substantial portions of the Internet. The integration of e-commerce, cloud computing, media, and aerospace creates an empire that Standard Oil might envy. Billionaires can now fund political campaigns and issue advocacy at scales that would have been impossible in previous generations. Why build a palace that generates no income when that same capital could fund a foundation that shapes global health policy or purchase a platform that controls how billions of people communicate? The mansion is obsolete because better instruments of power emerged. Modern billionaires build systems of control that most people do not even recognize as concentrated power. Yet for all this influence, they still need somewhere to live. Mark Zuckerberg's compound on the Hawaiian island of Kauai illustrates the fortress mentality. He purchased approximately 1,500 acres for more than $100 million and constructed a 6-foot wall around portions of the property to prevent observation. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore to be admired by the public. Zuckerberg hides behind walls and resents anyone who notices. Larry Ellison purchased approximately 98% of the Hawaiian island of Lanai for $300 million. He controls an entire island, something no American tycoon achieved in the 19th century. He has not built a single mega mansion on Lanai, but has developed multiple properties and luxury resorts. Geographic isolation provides security and privacy that walls alone cannot deliver. Ted Turner owns approximately 2 million acres of ranch land, and John Malone owns 2.2 million. These properties are working ranches that generate modest income. The power lies in controlling vast territories, not in building impressive houses. A billionaire who owns 1 million acres controls more land than many European principalities. Conservation easements provide additional benefits, allowing them to receive substantial tax deductions while retaining use of the land. The doomsday bunker trend reveals something darker about modern billionaire psychology. Since 2008, survivalist preparation has become common among Silicon Valley elites. Peter Thiel purchased property in New Zealand as insurance against social collapse. Companies now specialize in converting decommissioned missile silos into luxury underground residences with independent power and air filtration. Vanderbilt built Biltmore to display confidence and permanence. Modern billionaires building bunkers expect society to collapse and plan accordingly. The shift from palace to fortress to bunker traces a progression from confidence to anxiety to paranoia. Urban anonymity provides yet another strategy. Ken Griffin has purchased multiple floors in Chicago's highest residential buildings. High-rise living offers security through controlled access and the anonymity of living among other wealthy residents. The corporate campus residence represents the final transformation. Major technology companies now provide housing for employees on or near company property. For billionaire founders, the campus becomes a kind of estate. Larry Page and Sergey Brin effectively live at Google. Mark Zuckerberg's home sits minutes from Meta headquarters. The campus provides everything a traditional estate offered without the visibility and tax burden of a palace. Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin facility in West Texas sprawls across hundreds of thousands of acres. It is a commercial aerospace operation, but it also functions as a private domain away from public scrutiny. Every modern approach prioritizes privacy and security over display. No modern billionaire builds a 250-room house meant to be admired by the public and preserved for generations. The mansion, as a statement of permanence, has been replaced by compounds and bunkers.
Gilded Age mansions offended democratic sensibilities, but at least everyone could see the wealth and knew who possessed it. Modern billionaire holdings are vast, powerful, and largely invisible. The public cannot photograph what it cannot find. The historian cannot study what leaves no architectural record. Biltmore still stands because it became a public museum. Whether any of today's billionaire compounds will serve similar purposes a century from now remains uncertain. Most were designed to disappear. Today, Biltmore receives approximately 1.4 million visitors annually. They walk through rooms preserved exactly as they appeared when George Vanderbilt died. The estate operates as a profitable business, generating more than $100 million in annual revenue and employing 2,000 people. The house that consumed George Vanderbilt's fortune now generates income for his descendants. The craftsmanship that built Biltmore cannot be replicated today. The stone carving and woodworking represent skills that have largely disappeared from American construction. The scale itself astonishes. Walking through the estate requires hours. Size for its own sake no longer serves any social purpose. Biltmore is frozen in 1895, maintained as a historical exhibit rather than an evolving residence. The family seat became a tourist attraction. What was lost architecturally represents more than just buildings. An entire approach to construction disappeared. Gilded Age mansions valued permanent physical monuments over financial instruments. Modern billionaires make different choices. Their wealth flows into portfolios and platforms that generate returns and exercise power. These instruments are more financially rational, but they create nothing that will draw tourists a century from now. The tax system that destroyed mansion economics funded highways, schools, and hospitals. It redistributed resources in ways that created broader prosperity. Yet something was lost in the trade. The visible inequality of Gilded Age America was offensive, but it was visible. When inequality is visible, democratic societies can respond to it. Modern inequality is worse by most measures, but it is less visible. Billionaires hide behind LLCs and foundations. The system is harder to challenge because it is harder to see. Accountability becomes more difficult when power operates through platforms and foundations with minimal transparency. The concentration of power has increased even as the visibility of that power has decreased.
Biltmore stands as evidence of both what was lost and what was gained. It proves that concentrated wealth can create things of lasting aesthetic value, but it also proves that such monuments cannot be sustained. The billionaires stopped building because the world forced them to evolve. Whether they evolved into something better or merely something less visible remains an open question. Standing on Biltmore's terrace, the view stretches for miles in every direction, just as it did when Vanderbilt chose this hilltop. The house still stands because it transformed. The fortune that built it dispersed because it could not be protected. Nothing comparable will be built again because the incentives have changed completely. Future generations may not tour the archives of 21st-century media empires, for they will leave fewer monuments to photograph.